The engine had been silent for 20 minutes, but I remained in the driver's seat, hands gripping the steering wheel like it might anchor me to something solid. Through the windshield, the brick facade of Lincoln High looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by time and the weight of everything I had carried since leaving this place behind. Yellow lights spilled from the gymnasium windows, and I could hear the distant thrum of conversation, laughter that seemed to belong to people I used to know in another lifetime. My wallet sat open on my lap, and I found myself staring at the photograph again. It was creased from years of being folded and unfolded in moments of weakness, the edges soft with handling. Two 17-year-old boys stood side by side on the old track, their bodies lean and sun-darkened from a summer of running together. We were both grinning at whoever held the camera, but what struck me now, what had always struck me, was how close we stood. Not quite touching, but close enough that the air between us felt charged with something I had never let myself name. Julian's arm was raised in victory, having just broken the school record in the 800 meters. Mine hung at my side, but my shoulder brushed his, and in that fraction of contact, I could still feel the electricity that had run through me that day. The boy in the photograph looked so certain of himself, so unaware of the decades of careful distance that lay ahead. I closed the wallet and slid it back into my jacket pocket, the photograph safely buried behind family photos and credit cards, where it had lived for the past 25 years, where it belonged. The reunion invitation had arrived 3 months ago, forwarded from my old address by my mother, who still believed I might want to reconnect with my past. I had almost thrown it away. Should have thrown it away. Instead, it had lived on my kitchen counter for weeks, a quiet reminder of the person I used to be before I learned to build walls around the dangerous parts of myself. The gymnasium doors opened, and a couple emerged, their faces flushed with wine and nostalgia. They walked past my car without seeing me, lost in their own bubble of shared memories. I envied them their ease, the simple joy of looking backward without fear of what they might find there. I forced myself out of the car before I could change my mind. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of dying leaves and the faint echo of teenage dreams. Each step toward the building felt deliberate, rehearsed. I had practiced this moment in the mirror that morning, perfecting the smile that said I was doing well, that I had become exactly who I was supposed to become. Inside, the gymnasium had been decorated with streamers in our old school colors, and someone had set up a slideshow projecting photographs from our senior year onto the far wall. I recognized faces immediately, though they had been softened by time and responsibility. Everyone looked successful in the careful way that people our age cultivated, dressed in clothes that announced their accomplishments without seeming to try too hard. The conversations flowed around me like water, familiar voices asking familiar questions. How was work? Where was I living now? Did I have children? I answered on autopilot, my responses polished smooth from years of practice. Yes, accounting was rewarding. The suburbs were quiet, good for raising a family. 2 teenagers, both doing well in school. I performed the role of my life with the ease of long repetition. But even as I smiled and nodded and asked the appropriate follow-up questions, I found myself scanning the room, looking for a face that might or might not be there, hoping and dreading in equal measure. And then I saw him. He stood near the far wall, his head thrown back in laughter at something someone had said. The years had touched him gently, adding silver to his temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of a life lived without apology. He wore a simple blue shirt that brought out the color I remembered so well, and when he gestured while speaking, his hands moved with the same graceful confidence that had captivated me in chemistry class. Our eyes met across the crowded room, and the 25 years between that moment and this one collapsed like a house of cards. His smile faltered slightly, replaced by something I could not read from this distance. Recognition, certainly, but underneath that, something deeper, more complicated. The noise of the reunion faded to a whisper. The room seemed to tilt slightly, as if the earth had shifted beneath my feet. I felt the photograph in my wallet like a weight against my chest, evidence of a truth I had spent half my lifetime trying to forget. Julian raised his hand in a small wave, his lips moving in what might have been my name. The gesture was simple, natural, but it cut through me like a blade. All the careful construction of my adult life, all the safe choices and responsible decisions, suddenly felt as fragile as paper in the rain. I turned and walked toward the exit, my steps quick and measured. Behind me, I could hear someone calling my name, but I did not stop. Could not stop. The cool night air hit my face like absolution as I pushed through the double doors. I made it halfway to my car before my hands started shaking. The keys fell from my fingers, clattering against the asphalt. As I bent to retrieve them, I caught sight of my reflection in the car window. The face that stared back at me looked haunted, as if I had seen a ghost. Maybe I had. I slumped against the driver's side door, pressing my palms against my eyes. The words came out as barely more than a whisper, spoken to the empty parking lot and the stars I could not see beyond the glow of the streetlights. Don't start this. But even as I said it, I knew it was already too late. The drive home from the reunion passed in a blur of familiar streets and traffic lights. My hands steady on the wheel despite the tremor I felt somewhere deeper, in the places I had learned to keep quiet. By the time I pulled into the driveway of our colonial on Maple Street, the house was dark except for the porch light Clara always left on for me. A beacon of the life I had built, brick by careful brick, over the past 22 years. I sat in the driveway for a moment, staring at the windows of my children's bedrooms. Emma's room faced the front, her curtains drawn tight against the night, while Michael's was around the corner, probably still glowing with the blue light of whatever video game was consuming his attention. They were good kids, despite the way teenagers seemed designed to test every boundary. Emma had my eyes, but Clara's steady temperament. Michael had inherited my restless energy, but channeled it into soccer and guitar in ways I had never managed with my own adolescent intensity. The front door opened before I reached it, and Clara appeared in her robe, hair pulled back in the loose bun she wore to bed. She had been beautiful when I married her, and she was beautiful now, though the beauty had deepened into something more complex, marked by years of patience and the small compromises that made a marriage work. "You're later than I expected," she said, stepping aside to let me pass. "How was it?" "Fine," I replied, hanging my jacket in the hall closet where it would join the orderly row of coats and sweaters that defined our seasonal routines. Smaller crowd than I thought there would be. She studied my face in the dim hallway light, and I could see her cataloging the details that 22 years of marriage had taught her to read. The slight tension around my eyes, the way I avoided meeting her gaze directly, the particular quality of silence that meant I was processing something I did not want to share. "Anyone interesting show up?" she asked. "The usual suspects," I said, already moving toward the stairs. "I'm tired. Long day." She nodded, accepting the deflection with the grace she had perfected over the years. It was one of the things I had always loved about Clara, her ability to give me space when I needed it, to trust that whatever I was working through would eventually find its way into words. It was also, I realized with a stab of guilt, what made the lie so easy. Our bedroom was decorated in the soft blues and whites Clara had chosen when we moved into the house 15 years ago. The furniture matched, the artwork was carefully curated, and everything had its place. It was the room of a successful couple, people who had made sensible decisions and built a stable life together. As I changed into pajamas, I caught sight of our wedding photo on Clara's dresser, two people who looked impossibly young and certain of their future. I had loved her when I married her. Still loved her, in the way you love someone who has stood beside you through mortgages and parent-teacher conferences and the slow accumulation of shared history. But lately, I had begun to wonder if love was enough to fill the growing space between us, the careful politeness that had replaced the easy intimacy of our early years together. In bed, she curled against me with the automatic comfort of long habit, her breathing eventually settling into the rhythm of sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling and trying to push away the memory of Julian's face in the gymnasium, the way he had looked at me across 25 years as if no time had passed at all. The next morning brought the familiar choreography of a school day. Coffee brewing, backpacks assembled, the controlled chaos of teenagers who had inherited their mother's organizational skills and their father's tendency to procrastinate. Emma rushed through breakfast while texting her friends, her dark hair falling across her face in a way that reminded me startlingly of myself at that age. Michael appeared at the last possible moment, grabbing a piece of toast and his soccer gear before heading for the door. "Drive safely," Clara called after them, the same words she used every morning, a small ritual of protection against a world that felt increasingly uncertain. I left for the office 20 minutes later, falling into the routine that had defined my weekdays for the past 12 years. The accounting firm where I worked occupied 2 floors of a glass building downtown, filled with people who understood numbers better than emotions, who found comfort in the clean logic of balance sheets and tax codes. It was work that suited me, requiring precision and attention to detail, while allowing me to maintain the careful distance from my inner life that I had cultivated since college. My office was on the 3rd floor, with a view of the parking lot and a slice of the river beyond. The walls were decorated with my diploma, a few photographs of the family, and the small collection of awards that marked my steady progression through the ranks of middle management. In my desk, locked in the bottom drawer beneath folders of client files and office supplies, I kept a small wooden box that contained the remnants of the person I used to be. Track medals from high school, their ribbons faded but still carrying the weight of summer afternoons and the pure joy of running until my lungs burned. A few journal entries from college, written in the careful hand of someone trying to understand feelings that had no acceptable name. Ticket stubs for movies I had seen with friends whose faces had blurred with time, leaving only the memory of laughter and the ache of wanting something I could not have. And at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper that had grown soft with age, the photograph from the track meet. The same image I carried in my wallet, but printed larger, so I could see the details I had memorized over the years. The grass stains on Julian's uniform, the way the afternoon light caught the gold flecks in his eyes, the space between our bodies that seemed to hum with electricity. I had never told Clara about Julian. In 22 years of marriage, through late-night conversations and the intimate moments that bound couples together, his name had never crossed my lips. It was not exactly a lie, I told myself, just an omission. A piece of my past that belonged to a different person, someone who had made mistakes I would not repeat. But sitting in my office that morning, the memory of the reunion still fresh, I found myself questioning the careful architecture of my adult life. The house in the suburbs, the stable job, the marriage that looked perfect from the outside, but sometimes felt like an elaborate performance. I had built everything I was supposed to want, had become the man my father always hoped I would be. So why did it feel like I was suffocating? The day passed in meetings and phone calls, client consultations, and the endless stream of paperwork that defined my profession. But underneath the routine, I could feel something shifting, like the first crack in ice that signals the beginning of spring. The sight of Julian had awakened something I thought I had buried so deeply it could never resurface, a hunger I had spent decades learning to ignore. By the time I arrived home that evening, Clara had dinner ready and the children were settled into their homework routines. We ate together at the kitchen table, the conversation flowing around school projects and weekend plans, the comfortable noise of a family that functioned well together. But I found myself studying their faces as if seeing them for the first time, memorizing the details of this life I had built while part of me wondered what it would cost to keep it. After dinner, I retreated to my home office, ostensibly to finish work, but really to sit in the quiet darkness and try to understand what was happening to me. The room was filled with the artifacts of my chosen life: family photographs, children's artwork, the small accumulations of a man who had made all the right decisions. But in the drawer of my desk, locked away where no one could find it, the photograph waited. And for the first time in years, I could not resist opening the drawer and holding it up to the light, staring at the face of the boy who had loved Julian Matthews with a fierce, desperate intensity that had nearly destroyed us both. "What are you doing?" I whispered to myself, the same question I had been asking for 25 years. But this time, I was not sure I wanted to know the answer. A week passed before the email arrived. and I had almost convinced myself that the reunion had been nothing more than a momentary lapse, a brief stumble in the otherwise steady rhythm of my carefully ordered life. The subject line was innocuous enough. Lincoln High Class of '99, reunion photos, with cheerful exclamation points that seemed designed to convince us all that we were still the kind of people who got excited about seeing ourselves in group photographs. I opened it during my lunch break, sitting in my office with a sandwich I had no appetite for and the quiet hum of the air conditioning providing white noise against the possibility of interruption. The reunion committee had uploaded dozens of photos to a shared album, candid shots of people I barely remembered mixed with posed group pictures that would eventually find their way to social media profiles and Christmas cards. I scrolled through them with the detached interest of someone looking at artifacts from someone else's life. There was Susan Martinez holding court near the refreshment table, her laugh frozen mid-motion in a way that made her look exactly like she had in homeroom. David Chun and his wife posed stiffly beside the memorial display for classmates who had died too young, their faces carrying the particular solemnity people wore when confronted with their own mortality. And then I saw it. The photograph was taken from across the gymnasium, probably by someone trying to capture the general festive atmosphere rather than any specific moment. But there I was, standing near the far wall in my carefully chosen shirt and practiced smile, caught in the act of scanning the room with an expression that looked far more vulnerable than I remembered feeling. And there, not 20 feet away, was Julian, his head thrown back in laughter while talking to a group of former teammates, completely unaware that he was being photographed. The image quality was poor, pixelated from being taken at a distance and in dim lighting, but I could see everything that mattered. The way Julian's hands moved while he spoke, the easy confidence in his posture, the genuine warmth in his smile that had always been able to disarm any room he entered. And me, frozen in the moment just before our eyes had met, looking like a man about to step off a cliff. I stared at the screen until my eyes began to water, trying to read meaning into pixels and shadows. Had Julian seen me before I saw him? Was there something intentional in the way he had positioned himself? Or was I projecting significance onto what was nothing more than coincidence? The questions felt dangerous, like picking at a wound that had never properly healed. I saved the photograph to my computer without really thinking about what I was doing, then immediately regretted the impulse. But I could not bring myself to delete it. That evening, after Clara had fallen asleep and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, I sat in my home office ostensibly working on client files, but really just staring at the computer screen, my mind churning through memories I had spent decades trying to suppress. The Facebook notification appeared in the corner of my screen at 10:37, a small blue that seemed to pulse with possibility and danger in equal measure. The message was simple, almost casual. I think we missed our chance to talk the other night. Coffee sometime. Julian. I read it 17 times, parsing every word for hidden meaning while my heart hammered against my ribs like it was trying to escape. The tone was friendly but careful, the kind of message you might send to any old classmate you had glimpsed across a crowded room. But underneath the casual words, I could sense the same electric current that had always run between us, the thing that had made our friendship both the most natural and the most dangerous part of my teenage years. I closed the laptop without responding. The next morning brought rain and the familiar chaos of getting the children ready for school, but I found myself moving through the routine like an actor who had forgotten his lines. Clara asked if I was feeling well, her hand cool against my forehead, and I mumbled something about not sleeping enough. She accepted the explanation with the same patience she had shown for 22 years, but I caught her watching me with the particular attention she reserved for problems she could not immediately solve. At work, I tried to lose myself in spreadsheets and tax forms, but the message sat in my inbox like a bomb waiting to explode. I opened and closed it dozens of times, my cursor hovering over the reply button while I crafted and discarded a dozen different responses. Too eager, too distant, too honest, too safe. It was nearly noon when I finally typed a single word. Sure. I sent it before I could change my mind, then immediately wanted to take it back. But the damage was done. if damage was what this was. Julian responded within an hour with the name of a small cafe downtown, a place I had never heard of, but that somehow felt perfect for the kind of conversation I both wanted and dreaded to have. The cafe turned out to be a narrow space wedged between a used bookstore and a vintage clothing shop, the kind of place that served fair trade coffee in mismatched mugs and played jazz music just loud enough to provide cover for intimate conversations. I arrived 15 minutes early and claimed a table in the back corner, where I could see the door but remain relatively invisible to anyone who might know me from the other parts of my life. Julian entered at exactly 2 o'clock, his hair slightly damp from the rain and a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he scanned the room. When his eyes found mine, the smile deepened into something I remembered from chemistry class, warm and conspiratorial and completely disarming. He looked older, of course, but the years had been kind to him in ways they had not been to many of our classmates. His hair had gone silver at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter and sun, but his movements still carried the fluid grace that had made him such a natural athlete. He wore jeans and a simple gray sweater that brought out the color of his eyes, and when he slid into the chair across from me, I caught the faint scent of the same cologne he had worn in high school. "You look exactly the same," he said, which was a lie but a kind one. "Maybe a little more serious, if that's possible." I managed a laugh that sounded almost normal. "You always said I took everything too seriously. Some things deserve to be taken seriously," he replied, and something in his tone made me look up sharply. But he had already moved on, asking about my work, my family, the safe topics that formed the scaffolding of adult conversation. We talked for 2 hours, the conversation flowing with an ease that surprised me. Julian told me about his job as a graphic designer, the small apartment he kept downtown, the way the city had changed since we were kids. I found myself sharing stories about Emma and Michael, describing their personalities and quirks with a pride that felt genuine for the first time in months. But underneath the surface pleasantries, I could feel the current of everything we were not saying. The way Julian's eyes lingered on my face when he thought I was not looking. The careful way I kept my hands wrapped around my coffee cup to stop them from trembling. The weight of 25 years of silence that sat between us like a third person at the table. "You still do that thing," Julian said suddenly, interrupting a story I was telling about Michael's soccer team. "What thing?" "That careful way you have of talking, like you're editing every word before it comes out of your mouth. You did it in high school too, especially when you were trying not to say something important." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "Maybe I just think before I speak." "Maybe," he said, but his smile suggested he was not convinced. "Or maybe you've gotten so good at saying what people want to hear that you've forgotten how to say what you actually think." The observation stung because it was true, and because it came from someone who had known me before I learned to perform my life instead of living it. I looked down at my coffee, now cold in its chipped ceramic mug, and tried to think of a response that would deflect without revealing too much. When I finally looked up, Julian was watching me with an expression I could not quite read. There was kindness there, and patience, but also something sharper. Recognition, maybe, or challenge. "We should probably go," I said, glancing at my watch despite having no particular place to be. "Clara will be expecting me for dinner." Julian nodded and signaled for the check, but as we stood to leave, he placed a hand on my shoulder. The touch was brief, casual, the kind of gesture that passed between old friends every day. But I felt it like an electric shock, a jolt of connection that ran straight through all my carefully constructed defenses. "You know," he said quietly, his voice pitched just for me, "you haven't changed. Not where it matters." The words followed me all the way home, echoing in the silence of my car as I drove through the familiar streets of my suburban life. I had felt more alive in those 2 hours than I had in months, maybe years. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying, like discovering I had been holding my breath for decades and suddenly remembered how to breathe. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was shaking again. But this time, it was not from fear. This time, I was not sure what it was from at all. The second meeting happened 3 days later, ostensibly by accident. I was walking through Riverside Park during my lunch break, something I had never done in 12 years of working downtown, when I saw Julian sitting on a bench near the duck pond. He waved me over with the easy confidence of someone who might have been waiting, or who was simply pleased by an unexpected encounter. We talked for 45 minutes about nothing important, but I found myself reluctant to leave when my lunch hour ended. Julian suggested we do it again, maybe grab dinner instead of stealing moments between other obligations. I said yes before my careful internal editor could intervene. The restaurant he chose was small and dimly lit, the kind of place where conversations could unfold without interruption. We sat across from each other at a corner table, and I watched Julian's hands as he talked, remembering the way those same fingers had gripped the baton during relay races, steady and sure and completely trusted by the rest of us to carry us across the finish line. The memories came in waves after that, unbidden and vivid in ways that made my chest tighten with something I could not name. Walking home from practice on summer evenings when the air was thick with humidity and possibility, our shoulders occasionally brushing as we navigated the cracked sidewalks of our neighborhood. The way Julian would sit beside me in the locker room after particularly brutal workouts, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his skin, both of us too exhausted to move and too aware of each other to speak. There had been a night during our senior year when we had stayed late to help Coach Martinez pack up equipment after the regional meet. Everyone else had already left, and we found ourselves alone in the dimly lit equipment room, sorting through boxes of starting blocks and measuring tapes. Julian had made some joke about how we would probably end up coaching high school track ourselves someday, growing old and bitter while yelling at 17-year-olds who thought they knew everything. I had laughed, but the image struck me as impossibly sad. Not because of growing old, but because it implied we would somehow stay connected, that whatever this thing was between us would survive the transition into adulthood. Even then, some part of me had known it would not. Julian had looked at me strangely when I went quiet, and for a moment the air between us had seemed to crackle with the weight of everything we were not saying. He had taken a step closer, close enough that I could see the gold flecks in his eyes, and I had felt something shift in my chest like a door opening. But then Coach Martinez had returned, having forgotten his keys, and the moment had shattered. We finished packing in silence, and I had spent the drive home trying to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. Now, sitting across from Julian in a restaurant 25 years later, I wondered what might have happened if Coach Martinez had not come back. What might have been different if I had been brave enough to lean into that moment instead of spending decades running from it. Our dinners became a weekly tradition, though I was careful not to think of them as dates. Julian never pushed for more than I seemed willing to give, but there was an undercurrent to our conversations that felt both familiar and dangerous. He would ask careful questions about my marriage, my work, the way I had constructed my adult life, and I found myself giving answers that were more honest than anything I had shared with Clara in years. The phone calls started a few weeks later, long conversations that stretched late into the evening while Clara watched television in the living room and assumed I was dealing with difficult clients. Julian's voice in the darkness of my office felt like a secret I was keeping from the world, warm and conspiratorial and completely intoxicating. One night in early December, he asked the question I had been dreading. "What happened to us?" He said without preamble. "After graduation, I mean. You just disappeared." I had prepared for this moment, crafted careful explanations that would satisfy without revealing too much. "Life got busy," I said, my voice steady despite the way my hands trembled around the phone. "College, you know how it is. Different schools, different paths." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Julian finally spoke, his voice was gentle but insistent. "That's not what I'm asking about, and you know it." I closed my eyes and pressed my forehead against the cool surface of my desk. The truth sat in my throat like a stone, too heavy to swallow and too dangerous to speak. How could I explain the way my father had looked at me during my senior year, the careful distance he had begun to maintain, as if he could sense something shifting in his son that he did not want to acknowledge? How could I describe the sermons I had sat through at our church, week after week, listening to Pastor Williams describe the particular darkness that awaited men who gave in to unnatural urges. The summer after graduation had been the worst. I had felt Julian's absence like a physical ache, but every time I reached for the phone to call him, I could hear my father's voice talking about the importance of making clean breaks, of not carrying childhood friendships into adulthood where they might become complications. He never said Julian's name specifically, but I knew what he meant. I had always known. I just needed to focus on my future. I finally managed. You understand. Another long pause. Then, no, I don't think I do. The conversation ended awkwardly after that, both of us retreating to safer ground, but the question hung between us like smoke. I knew Julian was not satisfied with my answer, and I knew he would ask again. The thought terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. At home, Clara had begun to notice the changes. Not the meetings or the phone calls, which I had managed to keep hidden, but the way they were affecting me. I caught her watching me sometimes with a puzzled expression, as if trying to solve an equation that did not quite balance. "You seem different lately," she said one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. "More. I don't know. Distracted, I suppose. Work has been stressful," I replied automatically, the same deflection I had been using for months. "Is there anything I can do to help?" The question was asked with genuine concern, and I felt a stab of guilt so sharp it nearly took my breath away. Clara had been nothing but patient and understanding for 22 years, had built a life alongside me without ever demanding more than I seemed able to give. She deserved better than a husband who was slowly coming undone over someone she did not even know existed. "I'm fine," I said, kissing her forehead in what I hoped was a reassuring gesture. "Just tired." But I was not fine, and we both knew it. I was changing in ways I could not control or explain, becoming someone I had not been since I was 17 and stupid enough to believe that wanting something badly enough might actually make it possible. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in mid-December. I had been planning to work late, or at least to tell Clara I was working late, when Julian called and suggested we meet for drinks. There was something in his voice that made it impossible to say no, a urgency that cut through all my careful defenses. We met at a bar downtown, dimly lit and nearly empty on a weeknight. Julian was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with 2 glasses of whiskey waiting on the table between us. "You're going to tell me what really happened," he said as I slid into the booth across from him. "And don't give me any more bullshit about being busy." The whiskey burned on the way down, but it also loosened something in my chest that had been wound tight for months. I looked at Julian's face in the amber light of the bar and felt 17 again, terrified and desperate and completely out of my depth. "My father," I finally said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. "He thought we were getting too close." Julian's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes. "And what did you think?" "I thought he was right," I whispered. The admission hung between us like a confession, raw and dangerous and impossible to take back. Julian reached across the table and covered my hand with his, the touch sending electricity up my arm and straight into my chest. "I've been thinking about you for 25 years, he said quietly. "Every day? Did you ever think about me?" The question broke something open inside me that I had been keeping carefully sealed. I looked at our joined hands on the scarred wooden table and felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "Every day," I said. We sat in silence for a long time after that, the weight of our admission settling between us like something alive. When I finally looked up, Julian was watching me with an expression I remembered from that night in the equipment room, tender and patient and completely certain. I drove home in a daze, my hands shaking on the steering wheel and my mind reeling with the implications of what had just happened. In the driveway of my house, surrounded by the artifacts of the life I had built to keep this moment from ever occurring, I sat in the darkness and whispered the question that had been haunting me for weeks. "What are you doing?" But even as I asked it, I knew I could not stop. Whatever was happening between Julian and me had moved beyond my control, beyond the careful boundaries I had spent decades constructing. For the first time in 25 years, I felt alive in ways that terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. And despite everything I stood to lose, I was not sure I wanted it to end. The days that followed our confession at the bar felt suspended, as if the normal rules of time had been temporarily suspended to accommodate the weight of what we had finally spoken aloud. I moved through my routine like someone walking underwater, everything muffled and strange and requiring tremendous effort. Clara asked twice if I was coming down with something, her hand cool against my forehead, and I nodded because it seemed easier than trying to explain that I was actually coming apart. Julian called the next evening while I was helping Emma with her calculus homework, his voice warm and careful through the phone. He suggested dinner again, somewhere quiet where we could talk, and I found myself agreeing despite the way my chest tightened at the thought of being alone with him so soon after the bar. But when the evening came, I discovered I could not go through with it. I sat in my car outside the restaurant for 20 minutes, watching through the windows as Julian checked his watch and finally ordered something to drink while he waited. My phone buzzed with his texts, gentle inquiries about whether I was running late, but I could not bring myself to respond. Instead, I drove home and told Clara I had stayed late at the office to finish a project. The lie felt heavier than usual, and I caught her studying me with the particular attention she reserved for problems that required solving. But she said nothing, and I retreated to my office to stare at the computer screen and try to convince myself that I was doing the right thing. Julian did not call for 3 days, and the silence felt like a form of punishment. When my phone finally rang on Sunday evening, I answered before the first ring had finished. "Are you okay?" he asked without preamble. I was worried. "I'm fine," I said, though we both knew it was not true. "I'm sorry about dinner. Something came up with work." The pause on the other end of the line was long enough that I wondered if he was going to challenge the obvious lie. Instead, he said quietly, "Why don't you come over instead? My place. We don't have to go anywhere." The suggestion terrified me in ways I could not articulate, but I heard myself agreeing before my rational mind could intervene. Julian lived in a converted loft downtown, and I had never seen it, had never been alone with him anywhere that belonged entirely to him. The thought made my hands shake as I told Clara I needed to run an errand. The building was older, brick and iron, in a part of the city that had been industrial before artists and young professionals had claimed it for themselves. Julian's apartment was on the 4th floor, up a narrow staircase that smelled of coffee and old wood. When he opened the door, I was struck by how perfectly the space seemed to reflect him. Clean lines and warm colors, artwork on the walls that suggested travel and curiosity, books stacked in careful piles that spoke of someone who still believed reading could change you. The living room was dimly lit by lamps in the corners, and there was music playing softly from speakers I could not see, something instrumental and atmospheric that seemed designed to encourage the kind of conversation that happened in whispers. Julian poured wine without asking if I wanted any, and I accepted the glass gratefully, needing something to do with my hands. We talked for 2 hours about everything except what we were both thinking about. Julian told me about a project he was working on, the design for a book cover that was proving more challenging than expected. I found myself describing Emma's college applications, the particular anxiety that came with watching your child prepare to leave the life you had built for them. But underneath the surface conversation, I could feel the current of everything we were not saying. The way Julian's eyes lingered on my face when he thought I was not looking. The careful distance I maintained between us on his couch, close enough to feel the warmth of his presence, but far enough away that our knees would not accidentally touch. As the evening wore on, I found myself talking more than usual, words spilling out of me in a nervous stream that I seemed unable to control. I told him about the pressure I felt at work, the way success seemed to require a kind of performance that left me exhausted. I described the strange distance that had grown between Clara and me, not from any lack of love, but from the slow accumulation of things left unsaid. "You're doing it again," Julian said suddenly, interrupting a rambling explanation of why I had been working so many late nights lately. "Doing what?" "That thing where you talk around what you're actually trying to say. Like you're afraid the real words might be too dangerous to speak out loud." I looked down at my wine glass, nearly empty now, and felt heat rise in my cheeks. "Maybe some words are dangerous. Maybe," he agreed. "But maybe that's what makes them worth saying." The silence that followed felt charged with possibility and dread in equal measure. I could feel Julian watching me, waiting for something I was not sure I was capable of giving. When I finally looked up, his expression was patient but uncompromising, as if he had decided that whatever happened next would happen honestly or not at all. "This is complicated," I said, the words feeling inadequate even as I spoke them. "I have a family, responsibilities. I can't just—" Julian moved closer on the couch, close enough that I could smell his cologne and see the silver threads in his hair. His hand found mine where it rested on the cushion between us, his fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture that felt both natural and revolutionary. "You keep talking about what you can't do," he said quietly. "What about what you want to do?" The question hung in the air between us, simple and impossible and completely terrifying. I thought about Clara sleeping in our bed, trusting that her husband was where he said he would be, doing what he said he was doing. I thought about Emma and Michael, building their own lives on the foundation of the family we had given them, never questioning whether that foundation was as solid as it appeared. But I also thought about the 17-year-old boy who had stood too close to his best friend in the equipment room and felt his world shift on its axis. The boy who had spent 25 years learning to want smaller things, safer things, things that would not require him to choose between love and survival. I began, then stopped, the words too large and too dangerous to finish. Julian's free hand moved to cup my face, his thumb brushing against my cheek with a tenderness that nearly undid me. For a moment we stayed like that, suspended between what was and what might be, while the music played and the city hummed beyond the windows. "Don't overthink it," he whispered, and then he was kissing me. For a moment, I was frozen, my mind reeling with the impossibility of what was happening. This was the thing I had run from, the line I had sworn I would never cross, the door I had sealed shut so thoroughly that I had convinced myself it no longer existed. But Julian's lips were warm and certain against mine, and something inside me that had been wound tight for 25 years finally snapped. The world fell away. There was no house in the suburbs, no marriage built on careful compromises, no children whose lives depended on my ability to be the man they needed me to be. There was only this, Julian's hands in my hair, the taste of wine and possibility on his lips, the terrifying liberation of finally letting myself want something without calculating the cost. When we broke apart, I was trembling. Julian's forehead rested against mine, both of us breathing hard, and I could feel tears on my cheeks though I did not remember starting to cry. "I can't," I whispered, though even as I said it, I knew the lie in the words. Julian's thumb traced the line of my jaw, his touch gentle but unwavering. "You just did," he said. The truth of it hit me like a physical blow. I had crossed the line I had spent decades building, had allowed myself to feel the thing I had buried so deeply I had almost convinced myself it never existed. And despite everything I stood to lose, despite the careful life I had constructed to keep this moment from ever happening, I felt more alive than I had in 25 years. "I can't," I said again, but the words had no power anymore. Julian kissed me again, softer this time, and I let myself fall into it completely, into the terrifying freedom of finally stopping the performance and allowing myself to be exactly who I was. For the first time since I was 17 years old, I stopped running. I drove home that night in a state of suspended animation, my hands steady on the wheel while my entire world shifted beneath me. The taste of Julian lingered on my lips, and I found myself touching them at red lights, as if I could still feel the imprint of his mouth against mine. The familiar streets of my neighborhood looked strange, like scenery from a play I was no longer sure I wanted to be in. The house was dark when I arrived, Clara already asleep, the children lost in their teenage worlds behind closed doors. I stood in the hallway for a long time, studying the framed photographs that documented our family history, and felt like an archaeologist examining artifacts from someone else's life. There was our wedding day, both of us impossibly young and certain. Emma's first steps, captured in blurry motion. Michael's high school graduation, all three of us beaming with pride and possibility. In every image, I wore the same expression, careful, composed, present but somehow held in reserve. The face of a man who had learned to perform contentment so convincingly that even he had begun to believe it was real. The days that followed passed in a haze of barely contained chaos. I went through the motions of my routine, coffee, work, dinner conversations, bedtime rituals, but I felt like an actor who had forgotten his lines. Everything required tremendous effort, as if I were moving through water or trying to breathe at altitude. Clara asked twice if I was feeling well, and I nodded because the alternative was to tell her that I was finally feeling something, and that the sensation was both exhilarating and terrifying. At work, I sat through meetings where I nodded at appropriate intervals while my mind replayed every moment of the evening with Julian. The weight of his hand against my face. The way he had looked at me in the seconds before he leaned in, patient and certain and completely unafraid. The sound I had made when his lips finally touched mine, something between a sigh and a sob that came from a place so deep I had not known it existed. Julian called 3 times during that first week, but I let each call go to voicemail. His messages were gentle, concerned, asking if I was okay and whether he could see me again. I deleted them without responding, but I could not delete the way his voice made my chest tighten with longing and panic in equal measure. By the end of the week, Clara had stopped asking if I was sick and started watching me with the particular intensity she reserved for problems that required immediate attention. She would catch me staring into space during dinner or standing motionless in the bathroom while brushing my teeth, and I could see her cataloging these moments like symptoms of an illness she had not yet learned to diagnose. The confrontation came on a Thursday evening. The children had retreated to their rooms after dinner, Emma to work on college essays and Michael to whatever virtual world currently consumed his attention. Clara and I were cleaning up in the kitchen, moving through the choreography of 22 years of shared domestic life, when she suddenly stopped loading the dishwasher and turned to face me. "Where are you?" she asked quietly. The question was so unexpected that I nearly dropped the plate I was drying. "What do you mean?" "I mean you're not here, Adrienne. You haven't been here for weeks. Your body is in this house. You're going through the motions, but you're somewhere else entirely. So where are you?" The directness of her question cut through all my carefully constructed defenses. I looked at Clara, really looked at her, and saw 2 decades of patience wearing thin, the accumulated weight of all the conversations we had never quite finished, all the truths we had skirted around in the name of keeping peace. I opened my mouth to offer another deflection, another excuse about work stress or midlife fatigue, but the words would not come. Instead, something inside me cracked open like an eggshell, and the truth poured out in a torrent I could not control. "There's someone," I said, and even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were both completely accurate and utterly inadequate. Clara went very still, her hands frozen on the dish towel she had been holding. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, and I could see her processing the implications, her mind working through possibilities she had never allowed herself to consider. "Someone from work?" she asked finally, her voice carefully neutral. "Someone from high school," I said. "The reunion. Julian Matthews." I watched her face carefully, looking for some flicker of recognition, but the name meant nothing to her. Why would it? I had never spoken it aloud in our house, had never allowed the past to intrude on the life we had built together. "I don't understand," she said. And then, because there was no going back now, because the careful architecture of my adult life was already collapsing around me, I told her everything. About Julian and me as teenagers, the feelings I had buried so deeply I had convinced myself they were not real. About the reunion and the photograph and the coffee that had led to dinners, that had led to phone calls, that had led to the moment when everything I had been running from finally caught up with me. I told her about my father's warnings and the church sermons and the terror that had driven me to choose safety over truth, to build a life that looked right from the outside while leaving me hollow at the core. I told her about the kiss, about the way it had felt like coming alive after 25 years of sleepwalking, about the man I had been pretending to be versus the man I actually was. Clara listened without interrupting, her face growing paler with each revelation. When I finally ran out of words, the kitchen was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming and the distant sound of Emma's music drifting down from upstairs. How long? Clara asked. If you mean how long have I known, I said carefully, then always. If you mean how long have I been lying to you, then 22 years. If you mean how long has this been going on with Julian, then 6 weeks. She absorbed this information with a stillness that was more frightening than anger would have been. Then she set down the dish towel, looked at me with an expression I could not read, and walked out of the kitchen without a word. I stood alone among the detritus of our dinner, listening to her footsteps on the stairs and the soft click of our bedroom door closing. The sound felt final, like the last page of a book I had been writing for 2 decades, and I sank into one of the kitchen chairs and put my head in my hands. The next morning brought a careful politeness that was somehow worse than outright confrontation. Clara moved through her routine with mechanical precision, making coffee and packing lunches and reminding the children about after-school activities. But she would not meet my eyes, and when I tried to speak to her, she responded with the bare minimum of words necessary to maintain the illusion of normalcy. Emma and Michael sensed the shift immediately, the way children always do when the ground beneath their feet becomes uncertain. They moved through breakfast with unusual quietness, glancing between their parents and asking no questions that might require answers we were not prepared to give. I love you, I said to Clara as she gathered her purse and keys, preparing to leave for her job at the library. She paused in the doorway, her back to me, and for a moment I thought she might respond. Instead, she walked out without a word, leaving me alone in a house that felt like a mausoleum of all the choices I had made in the name of safety. I called in sick to work and spent the day wandering through rooms that suddenly felt like exhibits in a museum of my former life. Everything was exactly as it had been, but the meaning had shifted, as if someone had changed the lighting and revealed all the cracks in the carefully painted surfaces. When I could not stand the silence any longer, I called Julian. He answered on the first ring, and the relief in his voice was palpable. Adrian, he said, I was starting to think you'd disappeared again. I told him everything was falling apart. About Clara and the confrontation and the way my children had looked at me that morning, as if they were seeing their father clearly for the first time and did not recognize what they found there. Julian listened without judgment, making small sounds of sympathy and understanding, but he did not offer easy reassurances or suggest that everything would somehow work out. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. What do you want me to say? He asked finally. I want you to tell me what to do. I can't do that, he said gently. This isn't about me, Adrian. This is about you deciding what kind of life you want to live. I don't know how to choose, I said, and heard the desperation in my own voice. Yes, you do, he replied. You have to decide what's worth more, the life you built or the life you've been running from. The question hung between us like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. I thought about the house I would come home to that evening, the careful silence that would greet me, the children who were learning to see their father as a stranger. I thought about the job that no longer felt like enough, the marriage that had become a performance, the careful construction of normalcy that had required me to excise essential parts of myself. And then I thought about Julian's apartment, the way the lamplight had caught the silver in his hair, the sound of his laughter and the warmth of his hand against my face. I thought about the person I became when I was with him, unguarded and alive in ways I had forgotten were possible. It's an impossible choice, I whispered. No, Julian said quietly. It's the only choice you've never been brave enough to make. After we hung up, I sat in my office surrounded by the artifacts of the life I had built, family photographs and children's artwork, and the small accumulations of a man who had made all the right decisions. But in the drawer of my desk, locked away where no one could find it, the photograph of Julian and me at 17 waited like a reminder of the boy who had been brave enough to stand close to his best friend and feel the world shift beneath his feet. For the first time in 25 years, I wondered what might have happened if that boy had been brave enough to lean in. The kitchen was bathed in the gray light of dawn when I finally sat down at the table where my family had shared thousands of meals, where homework had been completed and birthday candles blown out, and the small rituals of domestic life had played out year after year. The coffee maker gurgled to life automatically, programmed by Clara the night before in one of those small acts of thoughtfulness that had defined our marriage from the beginning. I had not slept. Instead, I had spent the night moving through the house like a ghost, touching surfaces and opening drawers and trying to memorize the weight of 22 years of accumulated history. In Emma's room, I had stood beside her bed and listened to her breathing, steady and sure in the way that only teenage sleep could be. In Michael's room, I had straightened the soccer trophies on his dresser and wondered who he would become, whether he would remember his father as the man who had been there for every game or the one who had left when being there became impossible. The suitcase sat by the front door, a single piece of luggage that somehow contained everything I thought I would need to start over. It was smaller than I had expected, the physical remnants of a life pared down to the essentials. A few changes of clothes, some photographs that belonged to me alone, the track medals I had saved from high school, and the journal entries I had written in college when I was still young enough to believe that wanting something badly enough might make it real. On the kitchen counter, beside the coffee maker that would soon fill the house with the familiar aroma of morning routine, I had left an envelope with Clara's name written across the front in my careful handwriting. Inside was a letter that had taken me 3 hours to write, the words coming slowly and painfully, like drawing blood from stone. I had tried to explain what could not be explained, to apologize for what could not be forgiven, to offer some kind of closure for a wound that would take years to heal. My wedding ring sat on top of the envelope, the gold band catching the early light streaming through the window above the sink. I had worn it for 22 years, a symbol of promises made in good faith by a young man who had believed that love and commitment and sheer force of will would be enough to overcome the fundamental truth of who he was. Taking it off had been the hardest part of the night, the final acknowledgement that the life I had built was incompatible with the life I needed to live. The house was still quiet, my family sleeping through what would be the last normal morning of their lives as they had known them. In a few hours, Clara would come downstairs to find the letter, and everything would change. Emma would leave for school not knowing that when she came home, her father would be gone. Michael would spend the day at soccer practice while I drove toward a future I could not imagine, carrying only the hope that somewhere ahead lay the possibility of becoming whole. I thought about calling Julian, but the morning felt too fragile for conversation, too sacred to disturb with words. He would understand when I appeared at his door, suitcase in hand, and no plan beyond the desperate need to stop running from myself. We had not talked about what would happen next, what it would mean to build something real from the ruins of the lives we had been living. But for the first time in 25 years, I felt ready to find out. The coffee finished brewing, and I poured a single cup, black, the way I had learned to drink it in college when adding cream felt like an unnecessary complication. I sat at the table and wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic, thinking about all the mornings I had sat in this same chair, reading the newspaper while Clara packed lunches and the children prepared for another day of school. How many times had I wondered what it would feel like to be honest with them, to look across the table and see recognition in their eyes instead of the careful affection reserved for someone they loved but did not really know. The sun was beginning to rise now, painting the kitchen walls with long rectangles of golden light that shifted and moved as the world turned toward day. I could hear the first stirrings of life from upstairs, the creak of floorboards and the distant sound of running water that meant someone was awake and beginning their morning routine. In an hour, maybe less, Clara would come downstairs expecting to find me reading email on my laptop or reviewing files for the day ahead. Instead, she would find the letter and the ring and the absence of a husband who had finally chosen truth over safety. I finished the coffee and rinsed the cup in the sink, a small act of consideration that felt both meaningful and absurd. Then I picked up the suitcase and walked to the front door, my hand resting on the handle for a long moment, while I took one last look at the hallway, where family photographs documented the careful progression of our shared history. There was no way to do this without causing pain, no path forward that did not require me to become the villain in the story my family had been telling themselves about who we were and what we meant to each other. But I had finally learned that living a lie, no matter how well-intentioned, was its own form of cruelty. Clara deserved a husband who could love her without reservation. Emma and Michael deserved a father who could model what it looked like to live authentically, even when authenticity came at tremendous cost. I stepped outside into the crisp morning air, feeling the weight of the decision settle into my bones like something I had been carrying for years without realizing it. The neighborhood was beginning to stir, porch lights flickering on and newspapers landing in driveways with soft thuds that punctuated the quiet. I walked to my car without looking back, afraid that if I saw the house again, I might lose my nerve and retreat into the safety of the life I was leaving behind. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror of the front door closing gently behind me, as if the house itself was saying goodbye. The sound of my departure would be measured in the soft click of the latch and the fading echo of my footsteps on the front walk, a quiet ending to a story that had been years in the telling. I did not know what the future would hold, whether the world would grant me the peace I had never allowed myself to seek. But for the first time since I was 17 years old, I felt something stir inside me that I had almost forgotten existed, the dangerous, exhilarating possibility of living honestly. The morning light grew stronger as I drove toward whatever came next, and I realized that after 25 years of careful silence, I was finally ready to find out who I might become if I stopped being afraid of the answer.